Welcome to Supercool, the show about low-carbon innovations now scaling. Each week, we talk with the founders, CEOs, and executives whose companies are winning customers, growing revenue, and capturing market share by turning carbon-cutting ideas into competitive advantage. This is the rise of the low-carbon economy, a multi-trillion-dollar transformation already underway. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. September 2019, I was in the streets of Asheville, North Carolina with my family for the global climate strikes. My kids held signs. We marched through downtown. We felt the energy, the conviction, the collective determination to do something about climate change. And then we went home. That same day, Will Wiseman stood in Barcelona watching 100,000 people fill Passeig de Gràcia as far as his eyes could see. He felt that same surge of hope, and then the same despair. As he told me, we're all going to go home, and really, what is tangibly going to be different tomorrow? But Will did the unlikely. He took that frustration and built an SEC-registered investment platform. Climatize enables anyone to invest as little as $10 in renewable energy projects, solar, battery storage, EV charging, energy efficiency, all across the United States. The barrier to entry is pretty much the same as ordering your lunch. Link your account via Plaid, pick a project, and earn returns while funding clean energy infrastructure. To date, Climatize's crowdfunding platform has invested over $14 million across 31 projects in 14 states. Some projects raise as much as $200,000 in just 24 hours. Will thought his customers would be millennials skipping Starbucks to invest $10 or $100 a month. It seemed logical. Young people care more about climate, right? Well, as it turns out, the average account size is $50,000. His customer base is more Gen X and younger boomers. Effectively, he was off by a factor of 100x and fortunately in the right direction. Climatize started out as climate first in its messaging, save the planet, moral urgency. But investors tend to want returns first, impact second. So Will pivoted his company to that type of messaging. The platform offers investors attractive returns with interest rates ranging from 6.5% to close to 13%, depending on project risk. And so while the climate benefits are real, they're not necessarily the headline. And the good news is, they don't have to be. Climatize also has a particular niche. They specialize in projects between $250,000 and $5 million, a strategic sweet spot because institutional investors can't justify the consulting costs on deals of that relatively small size, and community banks aren't well versed in underwriting clean energy projects. So to compete there and operate profitably, Climatize has built AI tools that compress due diligence from days or weeks into 20 minutes. Suddenly, those unbankable million-dollar deals become extremely viable. The company is 5x the number of deals it looks at monthly, and developers now get capital within days, not months. For Climatize, speed to finance has become effectively a competitive moat. Here's my conversation with Will. Will, welcome to Supercool.
Josh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to this.
So there's so many things that are fascinating to me about your background, but I want to start with what sounds like a catalytic moment for how you got to Climatize, going back to 2019, climate strikes, climate march in Barcelona, 100,000 people in the streets holding up signs, expressing their concern, expressing their values about climate change, wanting something to happen, wanting to do something. And yet in that moment, while you were there, and participating, and by the way, so was I in Asheville, North Carolina with my family. I remember that moment. We were out in the streets as well. But something struck you that said, I'm not sure if this is exactly the way that we're going to go affect change, or maybe there's something else that you can do. So take us back and bring us forward to, where were you at that moment? What were you doing, and what did that lead to?
Sure. So I had just kicked off the first of my 2 master's degrees in renewable energy engineering, and my co-founder Alba Forens and I had just recently met and decided that we were going to go join those global climate strikes in Barcelona. And so we went to Passeig de Gràcia, which is one of the main streets in Barcelona. And I remember coming out of one of the subways and there was just this sea of people. And I stood on a bench to look out over this crowd. And it was about as far as you can see. 100,000 people is a lot of people. And in that moment, I remember feeling this kind of sense of hope and motivation that here are all these people that really want the change. And yet, at that same time, I felt this kind of sense of despair that also we're all going to go home and really what is tangibly going to be different tomorrow. I'm a very pragmatic person. I really saw this as if you get this many people together and their best option is to make a cardboard sign, there's a glaring problem. There's this disconnect between this motivation and actually translating that into tangible carbon reduction. And what is that breakdown between all of this pent up demand and actually being able to translate that into something tangible? And my entrepreneurial kind of light bulb went on and said, well, here is a big problem, but also here is the market standing in front of you. And these are all people who are potentially buyers of some solution if you can get to something that works. And so we really then dug into that core problem of trying to break down why is it that these people aren't actually active stakeholders in the energy transition? And why are they more so neutral bystanders who are relegated to the sidelines other than every once in a while when they get out in the street with a sign? And as we really dug into that, we were able to distill that common sentiment down to many people feel like climate change is an urgent problem, but they often feel powerless to make a difference. And when we asked what is it that everyone could contribute, the two commonalities that came out of that in a first principles way were either time or capital. And we then decided to pursue it from that capital angle.
Interesting. So were you doing that? I mean, was that research when you say to get to that insight, time or capital? And I say that because I mentioned to you before we came on air, I used to have a brand called The Lazy Environmentalist, and that was very much about what could you do in your life or what changes could you make with people coming from that same sense of, the motivations could be different, right? Why people want to actually move towards sustainability. Maybe they're suddenly grandparents and they're thinking about what's the legacy I'm leaving behind to my grandchildren and the future they're going to inherit, or their parents, and they're thinking, I now have a newborn. What is that baby putting in its mouth? I have to think about that in a way that I never thought about it for myself. And that's an opening, right? Or maybe it's just like I have come to some awareness about climate change and what's happening. There's all these different ways that people come to these views. But your insight was not necessarily saying, hey, we got to recycle more and all these things that are useful and potentially helpful, but it was really saying if people are willing to contribute their time if they know what to contribute it to, or potentially their capital. But still, getting people to part with their capital is not an easy thing to do. So take us forward to Climatize and how you came up with the service, talk us through it and the value proposition.
Sure. Climatize is an SEC-registered investment platform that enables anybody to explore investment opportunities in renewable energy projects across the United States. We focus predominantly on solar, battery storage, energy efficiency, and EV charging infrastructure. We just crossed the $14 million milestone, 31 projects in 14 states with 15 developers. And to that point that you brought about getting people to part with their capital, as we did that research and as we dug into that customer discovery, we did a broad-based, pretty open aperture sense of what are all the solutions on the table that people could pursue action with. And there was everything from, say, activism, which is the time play, and getting involved in, say, politics, over to options like buying an EV or putting solar on your roof. And we realized, for one, we're all very busy people, and there are so many competing demands in people's lives that allocating time is very hard. And we saw new entrants in the space like, say, Climatize, who I really love and respect the work that they're doing. And they're really solving for, I would say, the big time piece, which is the core of how we dedicate 8+ hours a day with our work into climate. But when we looked at the other side, so many of the solutions have major barriers in front of them. Like if you don't own your house, you likely can't put solar panels on your roof. You likely can't install that EV charger. If you don't have the cash, you can't buy that EV. You can't buy those solar panels. You might not be able to afford that heat pump or to be able to install the heat pump. Community solar is a great solution for renters, but there's a knowledge and trust gap there. And so many of these solutions had these barriers in front of them. I had previously used products like Kiva and Acorns to be able to make, say, micro investments or donations to entrepreneurs in emerging economies, and found that we are so device driven these days, and we're so digital that the barrier to entry of downloading an application and setting that up in 3 minutes and now linking your account via Plaid, which has little to no friction and people are used to, and being able to make that first investment in a renewable energy project in a matter of 5 minutes. And then finally, to be able to use almost the universal incentive of a potential return on investment has such a broad-based appeal that if you make that barrier to entry very low, which for us is $10, it's broadly accessible to anybody who has the intention to take climate action. And then as we found, when we begin to build trust with investors, we often see very rapid wallet share expansion from that first investment when it starts generating returns and they see a project come to life. There's this real aha moment of like, wow, I actually contributed to something bigger than myself. And this is not just putting capital to some ETF, which is a grab bag of various companies where I have no idea what my money actually went to. It's like, hey, I actually invested in this solar project on a Shakespeare theater in New Jersey, or I helped fund these EV charging projects in California. And I could actually go even potentially use the end infrastructure that's built by my investment. And that is it's a meaningful paradigm shift in how people think about investing as something tangible versus intangible.
Yeah, I heard you talking about that on another interview you were giving, and it really struck me. I think you may have used the same example of the Shakespeare Theater, but I thought, yeah, if I'm going to invest into the clean energy economy and I'm going to do something aligned with my values and I'm going to get a financial return, and that may be in my community or somewhere I can go see the actual physical manifestation of what my capital has gone to see this transition viscerally and experience that. That is so powerful to me, because I think so often what happens, and like on this podcast on Supercool, we're talking with like the solar developers or the grid infrastructure and all the stuff that we love, and it's so important. Mm-hmm. But it's so hard to put a visual on so much of it and be like, here's what the clean energy transition looks like, because you're looking at like, I don't know, a substation, right? And it's like, really? Like, that's the thing, And it's like, beyond a solar panel and a wind turbine and a battery, an EV charger, like, we're rebuilding our civilization. And so it's not always easy to see all this change taking place. But what I love about what you're describing, you can offer people a different lens to have that gratifying sense of like, what I am doing really is contributing. I don't just feel better, psychologically and in my bank account, but I actually see it manifest in the physical world.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that I think is really challenging about climate action, is that so much of it is a battle against this invisible gas in the sky, which we saw almost a vastly accelerated example of with COVID. If you have something that's this invisible boogeyman, and then some people saying it's the worst thing ever and some people saying it doesn't exist, you're going to create this polarization, and that's going to lead to essentially a lack of action in a way that we should have in a coordinated manner. And climate is a similar challenge in the sense that the best case scenario is that life stays the same. And the worst case is that we have a world that doesn't reflect anything that we have grown up in. And it's hard to pull the level of urgency from somebody if it's, hey, you're battling this invisible gas in the sky, and I promise that what you're doing really matters. Whereas in contrast, when you go and actually tell the human stories of the projects that are funded, that tends to have a much more catalytic impact on people. For example, my co-founder Alba and I visited 5 of the projects that had been funded through Climatize in May of 2025. And these were in rural Tennessee and southern Georgia, regions that you would not historically consider pro-renewables. But in southern Georgia, when Hurricane Helene hit this small town and they lost power for 7 days, and all of a sudden their microgrid, solar and battery storage, was able to provide cold storage for food and medicine and phone charging and cooling at night, all of a sudden that resilience narrative really impacted them in a tangible way. The broader community had this ripple effect of adoption and interest in potentially having their own, because even the wealthy people in town had run out of propane for their Generacs. And so this is when we make it human It is inherently a narrative that people can relate to and will be faster to adopt. I think this is one of the magical pieces that we bring with just the nature of Climatize, is it's not just about a solar project, it's about the people whom are benefiting from that.
No doubt. The lens that we see and what we're trying to often bring to Supercool is what you're describing. But we also see technologies, and not just technologies, but solutions that, in my mind, is, yes, this is about solving climate, and this is actually about building a better civilization, a healthier, a higher quality of life civilization. And you can see it often in cities where you could say, what do you want to do? Do you want to solve climate change, or do you want to improve quality of life? And you're like, oh, I just want to do things that improve quality of life. Well, guess what? The things that improve quality of life, they also solve climate change because they bring down carbon. You're going to have more safe, protected bike lanes. You're going to have better public transit. You're going to be able to get to where you want to go faster. You're going to move toward a 15-minute city. You're going to have stuff in closer proximity. Your quality of life is going to go up. And by the way, that's also really good for the planet too. So
less health impacts, all that good stuff, right?
All of the above.
Exactly.
Yeah. You want to design a cancer center that doesn't have cancer-causing chemicals in the walls? Well, guess what? You're going to get to a far superior building. It's going to cost the same thing. So what you're saying has a lot of resonance with me. Let's shift. You mentioned the projects in Tennessee, the projects in southern Georgia. Let's talk about how you build the marketplace. Let's talk about how you find projects or projects find you. I imagine that dynamic is probably shifting as you are gaining more recognition in the industry as a source of capital. What those projects are, because I know you've identified, as I understand, a pretty interesting niche in terms of size of project from a capital perspective, and the role where Climatize can really come in and play an important role that is hard for other institutional financial companies necessarily to do. So talk us through that side of the business.
Climatize started like many two-sided marketplaces, had to solve the cold start problem. What do you do on day one when you have your first project and no investors? And fortunately, we had built a wait list, and folks that had experience with some of the prior platforms like Wonder Capital, like Mosaic, were eager to use Climatize because they had had positive experiences with those previously. And so we were able to get that first $500,000 project funded in the first month, and then we're off to the races with that. Then Climatize really specializes in projects between about $250,000 and $5 million, and that being the range in which, in particular, these projects struggle to attract debt finance because that is largely driven to a lack of standardization and aggregation with respect to those projects. And additionally, many of the community institutions, they often don't know how to underwrite projects of that scale, neither from an economic nor a technical perspective. And so while you could go get $750,000 to build a commercial real estate building in your town, you would likely struggle to get that same amount of funding for a solar project from that same community bank. And so that's where we have been filling a gap. And so Climatize started out doing construction finance, predominantly solar projects. It's kind of a mid-level risk, mid-level return type opportunity. And then from the jump, we had developers increasingly asking us, could we do development capital? So slightly earlier stage. And in the beginning, we were like, hey, look, this is a little high risk, high return, but it's not going to necessarily be where we want to start. We did a number of construction finance deals and built that critical mass on the platform. And then we just kept hearing that pull. Can you do development capital? Can you do development capital? And so Climatize hired a director of finance, Jim Goldman, who previously worked at a number of boutique renewable energy financing firms, SunAlta and Soul River, and additionally had been a lawyer and an auditor at Deloitte. And so he had a very full stack experience in origination, tax equity, the whole life cycle of the project that went above and beyond what Alba and I had from the technical and project development side as well. Then we got more comfortable doing financing for certain risks, depending upon, say, if there was other construction takeout or key risks that they were looking to borrow against, or if there was, say, some kind of collateralized other asset, or if they had construction takeout with core risks mitigated, like I mentioned. And then we could move earlier. And that's where we have found a lot of product market fit with developers. And then we are getting those subsequent financings for construction by getting that early stage development finance with those clients. And
let me just jump in there and try and unpack some of that for myself
That's a lot of jargon.
And for our audience. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is you said initially, okay, we can provide construction finance. We get that because some of this earlier work has been done. Some of the development risk is taken off the table when a project's coming to you. I don't know whether it's easier to understand, but it was more in your wheelhouse to say, okay, we can understand this risk. We can figure out how to assign risk to it, how to assign a return. We can take that onto our marketplace and say, okay, this is the return. You investor on our platform, this is what we're offering on this project. And we feel really good about it and have high confidence, et cetera. And then you found, though, that there was perhaps a more pressing need from developers to go earlier and saying, hey, what we really actually need is the initial capital, or I think the earlier capital, the development capital. And then you're saying, oh, that's awesome, but that's riskier. There's going to be a different return profile assigned to that. We got to get smart about that, but that's really where the market was pulling you. And so then what I'm hearing is you're saying we can look at that, and that comes with a million different variations of how to understand it, right? Is there construction offtake? Is there some other partners? Like, how do we get our minds wrapped around? But basically, essentially, you did. And that seems to be unlocking, kind of keying into more as you were going, like where the real potential demand is that you can satisfy, where you're filling a real gap in the market, where what developers are really looking for to bring these projects to light. Is that a fair way to kind of reflect that back to you?
Yeah, so let me give you a user story here. We had a developer on the platform where they had a portfolio of community solar projects, and they had construction takeout by an institutional player lined up. But that early stage capital for them, they saw, here's our cost of equity, or we could borrow this where that cost of capital is going to be cheaper than that cost of equity for us. And we know that if even one of these projects in this portfolio hits, it's going to go from, let's call it roughly $400,000 that they borrowed to a roughly $30 million portfolio project.
And hold on, can you explain that? How does that happen? Walk us through that.
So often the developer's equity contribution in a project is roughly 10%. And so that's what they're putting in as their risk capital upfront. Let's say that they borrow $450,000 for 3 projects. Let's call it, just for simplicity, each of those is $150,000. Okay, so in that case, that $450,000 that they borrow, once those projects get to what's called notice to proceed, that portfolio of projects was now going to be worth roughly $30 million. And so even in the event that one of those projects failed due to some unforeseen risk, so let's call it a third of what was borrowed against. So now you went from that 450 to 300,000, but it gets roughly 10x'd by the value that then that construction project is worth. Now, when they get to construction phase, they can still pay out those prior investors with essentially the either future cash flows or their own balance sheet, because now they've got these essentially assets that are ready to build that are worth much more. When their construction finance comes in, they can repay that. And so we started taking a little bit more sophisticated approach to how we were doing that. And additionally, then we built a lot of AI tooling for ourselves, because one of the challenges that why Wall Street doesn't necessarily go and do these, let's call it $1 million projects on a farm, is that the consulting costs and local specialists essentially cost too much to be able to spend on a deal of that scale. You can do that on the $100 million deal. You can't really do it on the million. But nowadays, with kind of zero marginal cost of information, thanks to AI, and you can build sub-specialized agents, we are able to get an immense amount of information from not only the data rooms that are provided, but also surrounding information in about 20 minutes. And so historically, what had taken days or weeks now takes us minutes to be able to get to a very, very informed level, so that by the time we have that first meeting with the developer, we have all of our legal docs ready. We've got all of the full credit underwriting memo in place. We've done deep research across all of the moving parts. And that has enabled us to essentially 5x the number of deals that we're evaluating on a monthly basis. And that has been, I would say, one of the really exciting pieces about a good use case of AI is suddenly now you can do deals that historically weren't bankable just because of, say, the cost of labor to evaluate an opportunity like that.
That's amazing. We've broached that subject with a company, we've had Crux on the show that's doing right ITC tax credit transfers, and also a market maker right on their platform. And so that came up a lot about like the diligence room and how can you leverage AI to do the diligence once and then kind of be able to repackage it as companies are raising more capital over time. So how do you get really efficient? But it's so interesting to hear how you all are doing that to make something that's $1 million instead of $100 million viable and to expand the number of deals that you can look at and really get that kind of granular view. That's really interesting. That's cool. And so what then is the manifestation of that? You're looking at more deals, you're coming more intelligently earlier into the deal. I'm guessing that can also make a deal move faster if you're able to show up to that meeting with all of this information now pretty well vetted. And
yeah, so that's predominantly how Climatize competes on deals, is speed of execution. So we had, for example, that $432,000 portfolio of community solar projects. They raised that in 5 days on the platform. A separate developer for another portfolio of community solar projects raised $185,000 in 24 hours. That is just substantially faster than you'll ever get financing from an institution. And so, when you have that kind of community of folks that really want to create this change, then all of a sudden those types of opportunities get snapped up. And it creates almost FOMO within the environment of people who actually didn't get in fast enough to get allocation on something like that. And so that's where we have seen kind of a competitive edge in contrast to the broader market.
Yeah, I could see that on both sides, and I could definitely see how word of mouth for your pipeline of deal flow probably spreads pretty fast when people are talking about that.
The developers, they all of them want to come back and do repeat raises when they have successes like that, and they almost don't want to tell their friends about it because then they're worried that they're going to bring other projects and essentially lead to less available capital for them to raise for their projects. So it's a funny dynamic there, but we have $133 million of project pipeline at the moment, and that ranges across those 4 tech verticals, so solar, storage, EV charging, and energy efficiency.
How are you able to underwrite of course, you're underwriting the debt because you guys are underwriting the debt, but then it's getting community financed essentially to fund those deals. Do you only do deals where it's 100% Climatize financing, or do you participate in other larger deals as well?
We have not done syndications yet at this point. We have had, like I mentioned, the developer had construction finance lined up. We did not take part in that. However, we have looked at potentially trying to do syndications, but there's a lot of friction that comes with that. And so I would call it a future state.
Yeah, I get that. I understand on the developer side how you're getting projects and getting them onto the platform and the massive appeal in your execution. Before I turn to the profile of who investors are and getting more into that side of the marketplace, I'm curious to get your take, because one of the things that comes up pretty routinely on this show is talking to companies that are not necessarily climate tech companies in the clean energy transition, who aren't innovating on the technology. They're innovating on the business model that enables the technology to deploy faster and speed up the transition. There does seem to be this ongoing dynamic, certainly in America, and I think it's because we are at least we have this cultural conversation, this mythology, this sense of America that we're always inventing the future and we got to keep inventing to eventually solve climate change, where there's this countervailing view of like, time out, we got all the stuff, we just got to figure out how to deploy it smarter and faster. Do you have a point of view on that?
I probably lean more towards the camp of deploy at this point, because having started my career in solar in 2014, I was watching the kind of cost curves and LCOE of solar come down so quickly. And now we live in this world where there's a glut of solar getting pumped out of China, and you see countries like Pakistan last year essentially building 22 gigawatts of solar in no time at all and practically decarbonizing their entire economy in the course of like a year. I see that as something in which we're seeing similar behavior as the learning curve of batteries continues to bring cost per kilowatt hour of storage down. And so while there are obvious sectors where innovation will be incredibly enabling, if we figure out fusion obviously that'll be a fundamentally different energy environment. And things like AI are massively enabling for both businesses such as ours, as well as the opportunity to do massive power system optimization for, say, grid interconnection. Those are areas where, yes, innovation will be big enablers, because we have certain enduring problems like the interconnection queue that clearly aren't being solved by the technology that we have in hand today. While in other areas, it's like, hey, look, solar and battery storage are now sufficiently mature where we need to be moving as fast as humanly possible to get those out the door. And we should be thinking about just how do we make that deployment cycle as modular as possible. So if I had to make a split, it'd probably be 2/3 deploy, 1/3 innovate, because at the end of the day, if we have mature technologies, then we need to just figure out how do we finance them, how do we get them in place as quickly as possible, because the benefits are ready today.
You're describing on the battery cost curve, and it's just remarkable too how quickly battery costs are dropping. And I certainly agree. And we've talked to Camus, that's the team that came out of Google that's now working on actually building a similar kind of the infrastructure to solve with utilities that interconnection challenge, and how do you get smart about giving utilities the knobs to understand, well, if I turn this, okay, I can get this data center online, and if they just do a little bit of demand response or have some battery storage on site, like we can actually we can move faster. And we've talked to Schneider Electric that's trying to build the underlying system that all these technologies can plug into to kind of orchestrate it more. So it's really interesting to see that kind of innovation taking place.
I know that you've had Jigar Shah on the show, and he is one to really point out how innovation adverse the utilities are. And so just because we innovate the next best thing doesn't mean that they're going to go and take it on. And one of the things that I have learned over the last 5 years or so is that just because you make some new technology innovation doesn't mean that it's going to be able to make its way into the supply chains, because not only does that represent displacing existing processes, which are in a sense entrenched, but additionally, then you're talking about trying to change not only the financier's perception of risk of your new process that you're trying to implement, but then even one layer beyond that is the insurer going to insure this new technology that's now in whatever product you have. And so just because your new battery, anode, cathode chemistry is better doesn't mean that it's going to be adopted, because at the end of the day, there's a massive supply chain developed around the incumbent. And then there's the entire financing world behind that has normalized and underwritten that more mature thing. And so the warranties and the insurance are then structured around that technology, not yours. And so just because your technology is great doesn't mean it's actually going to be able to be implemented. And so that's really the challenge with the innovation play. Is like, if you make that 10x better mousetrap, you have a chance of getting in. But you have to really climb that hill on a number of layers that not all entrepreneurs fully, I think, appreciate, because the complexity is not just winning the technology game.
Oh, 1,000,000%. And that's, I don't know if we're saying exactly the same thing, but when I hear you presenting that point of view, what it triggers for me, again, is yes, there is the technology, but really, in addition to the technology, you also need all of this business model innovation to address the challenges that you're bringing up, right? Like, just as an example, we had a company called Forum Mobility on the show. They're operating at the ports in California and down in Long Beach. They've built a big EV charging station for 18-wheeler trucks to go electric. That's all well and good, but that's a very fragmented industry with a lot of mom and pop carriers, right? So it's not like they have huge balance sheets. So $400,000, $500,000 going to an electric 18-wheeler is a big deal. And so they said, okay, well, we come from the solar industry. We understand financing. We understand when assets that have value over the long term can be financed differently. We know how to figure that out. We know how to go to insurance. Let's just do a SaaS model here effectively, or like a subscription model. You get your truck and your charging and your maintenance all in one price, and we're going to undercut diesel, and let's go, right? And so now they're starting to scale up. But they're not a technology company. They're a business model innovation company. And I see that. So I agree with you, right? And someone has to figure out, how do I make this insurance palatable? How do I understand the financing? How do I come from like what's worked around solar industrially and then take that into other industries too? So wholeheartedly agree. And I think these are a challenge. Ultimately, utility CEOs, and I had Jigger on and he was very, very clear about what he sees, as the laziest way to get paid $25 million a year. So that was a very enlightening conversation. Fully hear what you're saying, but that's part of the innovation too, because I think it's very exciting. And I see Climatize playing in a similar space saying, hey, we have identified a couple of things here. We've identified a niche where the typical institutional financial players can't get into it or refuse to get into it. It just doesn't make economic sense for them to do it, right? But we've identified this pain in all these developers who actually want to do these projects and all these communities who need them, and you've built the mousetrap to make that work, and you've keyed into, which I want to talk about in some of our remaining time together, the insight and the way that, to go back to how we started this conversation, the 100,000 people on the streets of Barcelona, what they want to do. Either they're going to be activisty with time, not everybody has the opportunity to do that or the time, or they're willing to commit capital if it makes sense and it's probably like really easy and straightforward and understandable and viscerally exciting and hits their bank account, right? So anyway, I know I'm talking on and on here, but that's what I think when I hear you talking.
Funny enough, so we originally really thought that the prime user of a platform like Climatize was going to be more your millennial who's skipping their Starbucks and putting, $10 or $100 a month to projects. And that was just on the basis that a lot of secondary research pointed towards that demographic caring more about climate action. So we built our first financial models around essentially this idea of what if everybody pitched in $1 a day? Like very entrepreneurs, naivety, this optimism. So from that group in Barcelona, think $365 per year with 100,000 people in Barcelona. That's $36.5 million. And for those strikes around the world, there was 7.5 million people. So that's roughly $2.7 billion per year. And that was the original premise that we went after. It's like, okay, that's a non-zero sum of money that could actually build a decent amount of renewable energy projects. And now we see on the platform that the average account size is actually closer to $50,000. That means we were off by roughly 100x. And so the original $2.7 billion of idle capital could be closer to $270 billion of capital that is sitting on the sidelines waiting for that really easy way to open the floodgates of how do they actually participate in this in a tangible way. And fortunately, we were off in the right direction. And the ideal investor base is actually someone who's more of that later Gen X, slightly younger baby boomer generation. And those people are ones in which if you get a really strong believer core group where they're doing anywhere from $10,000 to $25,000 per project, then it only takes 25 people doing $10,000 a project to have $250K of idle capital ready to go as soon as you launch that project. And so there, as we build that flywheel and that kind of core kernel of the platform has grown, and we see that network effect where every subsequent project enables us to fund a project faster, which makes it more attractive to the next developer. The more projects we have, the more investors find more options that are better for them, whether it's in terms of closer to them and more tangible or meets their term and returns requirements, et cetera, et cetera. That's that virtuous flywheel. And so as we have gained more and more momentum and mass with that network, now projects get funded so quickly that it's leading to this really beautiful revolving kind of flywheel. And that was originally what I had in my mind when we went to build Climatize, was that each subsequent project and each investor continues to push this flywheel, and we just continue to gain momentum.
One of the things I know you've talked about at some point, curious to hear where you stand on it today, you've talked about having to pivot your messaging from climate first to finance first. And the conversation we're having here would lead me to believe otherwise. But can you talk to me about that dynamic when you're reaching out to investors and what they're looking for and what you've learned about what it takes for them to write that first check and how those checks get larger and larger?
The simple thing is that if you're going to run a financial platform, it should stand on its own 2 feet as a financial investment opportunity. That's just table stakes. And if you don't, then you're going to be in the bucket of concessionary or philanthropic capital. And that's a much, much smaller bucket of money. And so that's what we have really pursued is here is something that you don't have to feel like you're sacrificing to use Climatize. Because of that, we did lead with a lot more climate-first messaging in the beginning, but we found that ultimately people are using Climatize because they're making an investment. And that is just, call it what's in it for me question that everybody asks when they look to a brand or a product for a service. And so we have certainly shifted to that. And if you can win the person who's at your platform purely on the basis of finance, then you're obviously going to win the client who's there for the climate piece alone. So win one and you win broadly the whole messaging game. And then additionally, we have found, like I mentioned earlier, the play of climate for the sake of the moral hazard and essentially the need for us to take this action. That speaks to probably a demographic like me and probably someone like you, considering you're running a climate podcast. But for those folks in Tennessee, we are in a different phase in the adoption curve of the energy transition now. And the Trump administration has torn that Band-Aid off and made us all come to terms with it very quickly. And we need to recognize, if anybody has read the book Crossing the Chasm, that your messaging between essentially your early adopters and your early majority is fundamentally different. And the early adopters being us, where like I want to do it because my father was a marine biologist and I want to protect the coral reefs, that got us to today. And now we're selling into a different demographic of someone who doesn't necessarily care about the climate piece, but they're worried about the cost of electricity. They're worried about maybe these grid blackouts that are happening and will that have an impact on them? They're worried about, do they feel safe at night knowing that if something were to happen, they still have that energy security? And we as climate operators need to just accept the fact that we need to read our audience and adjust our messaging accordingly. If I'm going to message to an audience of people looking to invest, it's going to be around the financial attributes of the investment. And if I then speak to more of a climate group, we're going to talk about the impact and the climate angle. And then if I'm going to go to Tennessee, I'm going to talk to them about how does their project make them feel from an energy security perspective. We just have to get off of our hill of climate moral high road and come to terms with we just need to be pragmatic about how we speak to people on the things that matter to them.
Yeah, I love that. Is there a range of return? What does someone expect when they're looking at your projects if they're investing into a Climatize-backed project?
The highest interest rate on the platform has been at 12.75%, while the lowest has been at 6.5%. Obviously, have to caveat here that all investments carry risk, including the loss of principal, and you should all do your homework and due diligence and consult with a financial professional to make sure that it aligns with your goals and risk tolerance. So that's for the compliance team.
As you look forward today, I know you have ambitious goals for the platform and what you're trying to accomplish. How do you think about that? Do you look at it between, say, now and 2030 and where you're trying to get to as you continue to build Climatize?
Our goal is to fund $1 billion a year of clean energy projects by 2030. Now, I've mentioned some of the infrastructure that we have built to be able to process that volume of deals. So that has been, in a sense, when you build the foundation of a building, you have to ask, am I building a one-story building in the suburbs or am I building a skyscraper? And so we had to spend time doing that foundation building to be able to process the volume of finance that we want to be able to in the future. And then with the work that we have done to date and finding that the kind of crowd distributed network is very effective for that development finance, we see that as the on-road and wedge for us to essentially help originate more projects in the future. So it's almost like being like a seed investor with pro rata rights. So we, with our development finance, get right of first refusal for subsequent financing. As we develop increasingly complex or mature capital market strategies, we will have additional facilities to be able to support developers across that entire project lifecycle, not just that early stage work. So the crowd, in a sense, is a moat for us to be able to get in and get those projects early. And as developers see this as something where they can come and continue to raise capital that others can't provide, then we get that first look at opportunities that come from our platform, and we'll be able to then essentially follow on with refinancings and support developers over the course of their project's lifecycle. And so Climatize will then be able to offer a much more comprehensive financing solution, just as each subsequent success story enables us to prove our book, prove our underwriting capacity.
Will, it's incredibly inspiring to hear. So I want to thank you for coming on Supercool and sharing with us. And I wish you continued success. Very excited to follow your platform. It's just really wonderful to hear all the innovation that you've brought to bear to increasingly realize this vision. So I wish you good luck. I'll look forward to having you back to hear more. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for listening. If you're enjoying Supercool and appreciate our conversations that merge climate, innovation, and commerce, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a review. It's the best way you can help the show reach other future-forward decision makers who would benefit from these conversations too. See you next time.